There is a quiet kind of suffering that no one talks about. The suffering of waiting, not waiting for something painful to pass, but waiting for something perfect to arrive. Waiting for the right time, the right conditions, the right version of yourself. And while you wait, the days keep moving, the seasons keep turning. And somewhere deep inside, a small voice grows, quieter with every passing year. This is the story of a man who waited his whole life for the perfect moment. And what he discovered when he finally stopped, it will show you why the first step is never about being ready. It is about being willing. In a small river town, where the mornings smelled of wet earth and old wood, there lived a man named Daniel. Daniel was the kind of man who noticed everything. He noticed the way morning light fell across his kitchen table in thin gold ribbons. He noticed the rhythm of rain against the window, how it started, hesitant, then found its pace, then stopped, as if it had said everything it needed to say. He noticed the stories and strangers' faces on the bus, the unspoken weight behind. A tired smile, the quiet dignity of an old man feeding pigeons alone in the park. He was, by every measure, a man built to be a writer. And yet the page stayed empty. Daniel was 38 years old and lived in a narrow house near the river. In a town called Millhaven, he worked as a proofreader for a regional newspaper, correcting other people's words for a living, quietly tending to someone else's voice, while his own gathered dust in a drawer. That drawer. Everyone who knew Daniel knew about the drawer. His mother asked about it at Sunday dinners. His friend Caleb joked about it at birthdays. His girlfriend Nora had stopped asking about it altogether, and somehow her silence hurt more than any question ever had. Inside that drawer lived 114 handwritten pages. The beginning of a novel, a story about a father and a son and a river and forgiveness. The kind of story that only someone who had truly felt something could write. And Daniel had felt it all. Every word had come from a real and tender place. But he had not touched those pages in over 2 years because it wasn't ready yet. He wasn't ready yet. He needed more time, more clarity, or certainty that what he was about to put into the world would be worthy of being seen. He was waiting, he told himself, for the moment when everything aligned, when the story felt complete in his mind, when the words would flow without doubt or hesitation. He was waiting for the perfect moment, and the perfect moment, like a horizon, kept moving further away. It had not always been this way. There was a time not so long ago, Daniel was honest with himself, when he had known what it felt like to simply create, to write without armor, to put something real and unfinished into the world and trust that it was enough. He was 26 when it happened, eh? Local literary magazine called the Millhaven Review had announced an open submission for short fiction. Oh, the theme was simple. Home. Daniel had sat down on a rainy Tuesday evening with a cup of cold coffee and written a story in one sitting. 4 pages. A boy. A river. A father who never said the things he meant to say. It was quiet and imperfect and achingly true. He submitted it without rereading it. 3 weeks later, they published it. He still remembered the morning the magazine arrived at his door. He had stood in the hallway in his socks, holding it with both hands, reading his own name in print for the first time. Something inside him had lifted like a window being opened in a room that had been closed for too long. The response was, small but warm. His mother cried. His English teacher from secondary school sent a handwritten note. Stranger stopped him at the post office and said, "I read your story. It reminded me of my own father." That sentence alone had meant more to him than any award ever could. For a few weeks after, Daniel wrote every day. Ideas came easily. The novel began to take shape organically, joyfully, like something that had always been alive inside him, and had simply been waiting for permission to grow, he felt. In those weeks, like the truest version of himself. But then, slowly, quietly, the doubt crept in. What if the next thing isn't as good? What if that one story was a fluke, a lucky alignment of emotion, an accident? What if he wrote the novel and it disappointed everyone, including himself? And so he waited. Just a little longer, just until he was sure. The call came on a Thursday morning in October. Daniel was at his desk at the newspaper, correcting a misplaced comma in someone else's column, when his phone buzzed. It was his mother. Rose carried that particular brightness she reserved. For good news, warm, slightly breathless, proud. "Marcus finished his book," she said. "It's being published. Real publisher." "Daniel, isn't that wonderful?" Daniel said yes. He said of course. He said he would call Marcus to congratulate him. He did not call Marcus. He sat very still at his desk for a long time after, staring at the comma he had just corrected, thinking about nothing and everything at once. Marcus was 34. Years younger than Daniel, he'd never been the one people described as gifted. In school, his essays were enthusiastic but clumsy. He read less, reflected less, noticed less. Where Daniel saw poetry in ordinary moments, Marcus saw only the moment itself and moved through it quickly, loudly, without hesitation. But Marcus had written his book. It arrived in bookshops 6 weeks later. Daniel bought a copy and read it in 2 evenings. It was raw. It's unpolished in places. Some of the dialogue felt forced and 2 of the characters never fully came alive. Daniel noticed every flaw with the trained eye of a man who had spent years correcting other people's words. And yet the story moved. It was imperfect the way real things are imperfect, and somewhere in its roughness lived an honesty that made Daniel set it down on the last page and stare at the ceiling for a very long time. People loved it. Not universally, not perfectly, genuinely. And that was when something inside Daniel quietly broke. Not loudly. There was no anger, no dramatic collapse, just a slow, sinking recognition, the way you feel when you realize you have missed a train. Not the sound of it leaving, just the silence of the empty platform. His brother had not waited for perfect, and the world had met him anyway. Daniel told himself it was different. Marcus had always been reckless that way, rushing into things without thinking, without caring how they looked or what people thought. That was not courage, Daniel reasoned. That was simply a lack of standards, a willingness to put something half-formed into the world and call it finished. My work is different, he told himself. My story deserves more time, and so the drawer stayed closed. But something had shifted beneath the surface, something Daniel could not name and refused to examine. The waiting, which had once felt like patience, began to feel like something heavier. He started rewriting chapter 1 again. For the 17th time, changing the opening sentence, then changing it back, adjusting the father's name, the season. The quality of light in the first scene told himself he was refining, perfecting, getting closer. But the truth, quiet and uncomfortable, was that he was circling. Nora noticed first. She did not say it directly. It was not her way. But one evening, as Daniel sat at his desk, staring at the same paragraph he had rewritten 3 times that week, she stood in the doorway of his study and said softly, "Do you actually want to finish it, Daniel? Or does keeping it unfinished feel safer?" He told her she didn't understand. She nodded slowly, the way people do when they understand completely, and walked away. 3 weeks later, she moved out. Not dramatically, not with tears or accusations. She simply packed her things on a quiet Saturday morning, hugged him at the door for a long time, and left. The house, which had never felt particularly large, became cavernous overnight. Daniel responded the only way he knew how. He rewrote chapter 1 again. He stopped seeing friends. He declined Caleb's invitations. He worked, came home, sat at his desk, circled the same pages like a man orbiting a planet he was too afraid to land on. The days blurred. The river outside kept moving. Daniel stayed still. It was a Sunday in late November when Daniel finally left the house, not for any particular reason, not with any particular destination, had simply woken that morning to a silence so complete and so heavy that the walls of his narrow house felt like they were leaning inward. He put on his coat, walked down to the river, sat on a weathered bench near the old stone bridge. The water was the color of pewter that morning, cold and steady and indifferent to everything on its banks. Daniel sat with his hands in his pockets and watched it move the way it always moved, without hesitation, without apology, without waiting for permission. The old woman was already on the bench when he arrived. He had not noticed her at first. She was small and still, wrapped in a green wool coat, watching the river with the calm expression of someone who had long ago made peace with the world. A worn canvas bag sat at her feet. They sat in silence for a while. Daniel appreciated that. Then, she spoke. "You have the look of a man carrying something he hasn't put down in a long time," she said, not unkindly, almost gently, the way a doctor states a diagnosis they have seen many times before. Daniel looked at her. "Is it that obvious?" she smiled, only to someone who wore the same expression for 30 years. Her name was Ruth. She was 73. Years old, a retired art teacher, and she had not painted a single canvas between the ages of 40 and 70. She had waited, she told him, for the right studio, the right inspiration, the right season of life. And the years had passed the way years do, swiftly and without negotiation. "What changed?" Daniel asked. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then, she said simply, "I realized the waiting was the waste, not the imperfect work, the waiting." She reached into her canvas bag and pulled out a small, unfinished painting of the river. "I start everything now," she said. "I finish what I can." Daniel walked home slowly that afternoon. He did not feel transformed. There was no sudden rush of inspiration, no dramatic awakening, no moment where the clouds parted and everything became clear. That is not how real change arrives. Real change, he was beginning to understand, arrives quietly, like the first cold morning of autumn. Do not notice the exact moment the season shifted. You simply wake one day and feel it in the air. He made himself a cup of tea and sat at his desk. He opened the drawer. He did not take out chapter 1. For the first time in 2 years, he turned past it, past the 17 rewritten versions of the same opening page, and he found the last place he had stopped, page 114. The sentence that had been waiting, unfinished, for longer than he cared to admit. He read the last paragraph slowly. Then he picked up his pen and wrote the next one. It was not beautiful. The sentence was clumsy, and the image he reached for did not quite land the way he intended. Crossed out 2 words and replaced them with 2 different words that were only marginally better. He paused. He almost stopped. But he wrote another sentence after it, and then another. He did not write with the confidence of He wrote with the quiet determination of a man who had decided that an imperfect page was infinitely more valuable than a perfect silence. Every word he put down was a small act of courage, not the loud, not dramatic kind, but the humble, private kind that no one ever sees and no one ever applauds. He wrote for 2 hours that evening. When he finally set his pen down, he sat back and looked at what he had written. It was rough. It was real. It was forward for the first time in years. He had not rewritten the beginning. He had written something new, and in the quiet of that narrow house by the river, something that had been frozen for a very long time began, slowly and gently, to thaw. Spring came to Millhaven the way it always did. Quietly at first, a softness in the air, a reluctant warmth in the afternoon light, the river running a little faster with the memory of melted snow. And alongside it, in the narrow house near the old stone bridge, something else was quietly blooming. Daniel wrote every day, not for hours at a time, not in dramatic, inspired bursts. He wrote in the mornings before work, 30 minutes, sometimes 45, occasionally a full hour if the words came willingly. He wrote on weekends at the kitchen table with the window open and the sound of the river in the background. He wrote on evenings when he was tired, when the sentences felt stiff and the story felt distant, when every instinct told him to stop and wait till he felt more ready. He wrote anyway. He had stopped rewriting chapter 1 entirely. It was imperfect. He knew that. The opening sentence was not the luminous, weightless thing he had always imagined it would be, but it was honest. He had come to understand slowly and humbly that honesty on the page was worth more than elegance that never arrived. By April, he had passed page 200. By June, he could feel the ending approaching. Not as a destination he was rushing toward, but as a natural shore that the story was drifting toward on its own current. He did not force it. He followed it. On a warm evening in late July, Daniel wrote the final sentence of his novel. He set his pen down and sat in the silence for a long time. He did not feel euphoric. He did not feel the explosive relief he had always imagined would come with finishing. What he felt was quieter and deeper than that, a still settled sense of wholeness. The feeling of a man who had finally shown up for something he had been postponing his entire adult life. He thought of Ruth and her unfinished painting of the river. He thought of Marcus, perfect and brave and published. He printed the manuscript, placed it in an envelope, and sent it out into the world without waiting to feel ready. For the first time in a very long time, Daniel was at peace, not because everything was perfect, but because he had finally, fully begun. And so Daniel's story ends not with fame, not with perfection, not with the arrival of some long-awaited perfect moment. It ends with a man at peace. A man who finally understood that the life he had been waiting to live was always available to him. It was never locked behind the right conditions. It was only ever locked behind his own hesitation. And perhaps, if you were honest with yourself, you recognize something of Daniel in your own life. Perhaps there is a drawer in your home too, not made of wood, but filled with something unfinished, a dream deferred, a beginning never made, a voice that has been waiting, quietly and patiently, for you to stop waiting and simply start. Here's what Daniel's journey teaches us. 1. The perfect moment will never come, because perfection is not a moment, just a myth we use to protect ourselves from the vulnerability of beginning. 2. Imperfect action will always outrun perfect intention. The world cannot receive what you never release. 3. Waiting feels like patience, but often it is only fear wearing a more respectable name. For someone less prepared than you is already out there doing the thing you keep. And the world is meeting them not because they were ready, because they moved. 5. Every day you wait is not a day saved. It is a day spent, quietly, invisibly, on nothing. 6. The first step does not require confidence. It only requires willingness. Confidence comes after. Always after 7. Your story, unpolished, imperfect, and entirely your own, is worth more to this world than a perfect story that never gets written. So close this video for a moment. Open your drawer right. The next sentence, not tomorrow. Not when you feel ready. Today, if this story moved something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you are new here, welcome. There are more stories waiting for you. The journey, after all, begins with a single step.